I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome everyone back and to welcome you to paper 3. Andrew Jackson will be presenting for us this afternoon on the hoi polloi logia, Maximus the Confessor's incarnational panentheism, and the problem of selective design inferences. And I'm very much looking forward to this. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much, everybody, and for the organisers for accepting this paper, which is basically an extension of my recently completed PhD thesis on Maximus and evolutionary biology. And it's going into one particular practical application of my research. And it's in the domain of panentheism, and it's considering some recent trends in evolutionary biology and the theology of evolution. The reason for my somewhat facetious, flippant hoi polloi reference at the beginning, for those who are perhaps not native English speakers, hoi polloi, Greek, the many, was a term of derision, a derogatory term, not very often used these days, meaning the riffraff, the plebs of society. So you'll see soon why I'm using this term to refer to the logoi. The genre and positioning of this work is very much science-engaged constructive theology, but with a historical positioning in the patristics, one particular patristic author, Maximus the Confessor. And you might think, well, how on earth can you do that kind of theology with an ancient source? And I'm certainly not wanting to read into Maximus modern concepts, but I do believe you can have a dialogue and a synthesis of ancient thought and modern thought. And I don't think also that I'm going to be breaking any new ground as regards the exegesis of Maximus. Much of what I say has already been said by scholars of Maximus. I think the novelty, if there is any novelty, is at the interface between the philosophy, the science, and the textual evidence. What I want to do is to, first of all, explain to you something about Maximus's very famous logoi doctrine. I want to try and argue that it's a species of panentheism, in which even the ordinary particular things are indwelt by God, i.e. the hoi polloi, the general common things of the world. And my view of the panentheism is certainly not unique to me. There are many Maximus scholars who would say the same thing. I then want to draw some implications for a theology of evolution. So recap a bit on my thesis work before going on to the very practical application of how it relates to recent attempts to kind of resurrect a selective design argument for God. And I'm going to be arguing that that is a mistake to try to do that with Maximus. So who was Maximus and why bother to study his work? Well, he was a Byzantine 7th century monk and theologian. The reason he's called the Confessor is because he was martyred by having his tongue and right hand cut off for his temerity to oppose the emperor at the time, who believed that Jesus only had one will, whereas Maximus famously argued that he has two wills. So that's the monothelite controversy. He was also, well, he represents a high point of Eastern patristics, having been influenced by a number of famous theologians, Evagrius Ponticus, the Cappadocian Church Fathers, and the Neoplatonists. And there has been, I think it's fair to say, a renaissance of interest in Maximus in recent decades. However, a relative paucity of engagement with the natural sciences. And Maximus is particularly famous for what he says about creation in terms of the logos and the logoi. So I do need to introduce you if you're not already familiar with that. So the logos, the Greek word derived from the verb legein, to say, is a word with many meanings that cluster around a family resemblance, meaning argument, definition, principle, intelligibility, that kind of thing. The plural logoi came to mean the splitting or refraction of the logos into individual components. And it has a rich philosophical heritage going back to Plato's demiurge creating according to a logos archetype, and the Stoic rational principles. And of course, it has a biblical rooting in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And also in the Pauline epistles, there's so-called prepositional metaphysics going on, where Paul talks about from him, through him, and to him are all things. Now, Maximus expounds on this greatly in one of his works in particular, and he does so to refute Origenism. This is the followers of Origen, who thought that the reason for all the material differences of things in the world was due to God's punishing them for falling away. Instead, Maximus was insistent that all the differences of the world are good differences because they are due to the logos defining them. Indeed, he went as far as to say that the logos is in creation in three ways: in creation itself, in the historical incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, and in the letters and words of Scripture. He also somewhat paradoxically and mystically said that the logos is the logoi, and the logoi are the logos. And this has been interpreted in a number of different ways, which I don't have time to go into. The logoi as either divine ideas, divine wills, divine energies, or even the divine person of the second person of the Trinity. What I want to do is to give you a bit more detail about the characteristics of the logoi that are relevant to creation and evolution. And this is described in more detail, a shameless plug for my book here, Maximus the Confessor and Evolution, which is far too expensive for anybody to want to buy, but maybe you could find it electronically in a library. I want to just say a few words about the top four on that list: defining, dynamic, temporal, entangled. I don't have time to go into the other two. And I want to share with you, give you a flavor of some of the textual evidence, because I think it's very important in doing this kind of theology to be very much rooted in the text, which is like the equivalent to the data in doing science. So first of all, the defining and immanent logoi. So Maximus says that the logoi account for the similarities and differences of all creatures. He says, if the many things are different, it must be understood that their logoi, according to which they exist, are also different, since it's in these, or rather because of these, that all different things differ. Secondly, and most importantly, the logoi define particulars or individuals as well as universals or species or genera. He says the whole of God is indivisibly present in each particular thing according to the logos through which that thing exists in its own way. And elsewhere he says God is whole in all things commonly and in each being particularly. The logoi are also what you could call constitutively immanent. Maximus says the logoi exist within beings and create the essences of those beings and preserve them in existence. And scattered around many of his works, he says the logoi are either implanted, intermingled, engrafted, or embedded. So you get the idea here that by immanent, it doesn't just mean near or present to, but interior or inherent to. And finally, the logoi emanate from the logos without any diminishment or attenuation. Bit of a long quote here. If beings possess perfection by divine foreknowledge, but emerge as imperfect when they enter existence by means of creation, then either they are not that which was foreknown, but something other, or else the difference between the two constitutes a clear weakness on the part of the Creator, who was not able to realize fully in creation what he had envisaged in his foreknowledge. In other words, I take this to mean that God intends exactly what he gets. And this is quite different from a Platonic view of the world, in which there's an intelligible, eternal realm with the archetypes, and then a sensible kind of shadowy world that we live in, which is only a pale reflection of the eternal world. With Maximus, the divine ideas are exactly replicated in the world in which we live. The next attribute of the logoi are that they are moving or dynamic, and Maximus describes this motion in three different ways. The first one is a journey of becoming, a second is procession and return, and the third is an expansion and contraction. So in Ambiguum 7, he famously talks about, in one of his many triads, the logoi moving from being to well-being to eternal well-being. It's a process of starting outside space and time in the divine mind, as it were, then coming into space and time and flourishing in well-being, and then going outside space and time into deification, which is an eternal well-being. But it's also, for Maximus, a procession and return, which is very much a Neo-Platonic view. He says, according to the creative and sustaining procession of the one to individual beings, the one is many. According to the revertive, inductive, and providential return of the many to the one, and here's an interesting analogy, as if to an all-powerful point of origin, or the center of a circle pre-containing the beginnings of the radii originating from it, insofar as the one gathers everything together, the many are one. So this goes back to Neoplatonic thinking, as I said, and he's borrowing here an image from Plotinus of a kind of a starburst or a wheel, with the center being the logos and the spokes being the many logoi radiating out. And again, it goes back to Romans 11:36, from him and through him and to him are all things. And the final motif is one of expansion and contraction. The substance, ousia, of all beings has been set in motion and continues to move according to the principle and mode of expansion, diastolane, and contraction, systolane. For it is moved from the most generic genus through the more generic genera to particular species, through which and in which it is naturally divided, proceeding down to the most specific species, where its expansion comes to a limit. And once again, it's gathered back from the most specific kinds of species, moving back through more and more general categories until it is gathered up to the most generic genus. Next, the temporal logoi. Maximus's vision of expanding and contraction and processing and reverting isn't just an abstract contemplation of the hierarchical order of nature. And the reason I claim this is because Maximus talks about the logos appearing at the right time. By his word and in his wisdom, he created and continues to create all things, universals as well as particulars, at the appropriate time, and uses the Greek word chronon in that case. But elsewhere, he says individual things were created at the appropriate moment in time, kairo, a different Greek word for time, and in a manner consistent with their logoi, and thus they received themselves actual existence as beings. So the movement is at least partly temporal as well. And I think this is quite important because this brings Maximus's vision into potential dialogue with natural sciences, without which it could just be a metaphysical vision and have no engagement with the reality around us. So what we have here then, on the left is this circle or starburst image on which I've superimposed a hierarchical expansion, and that's occurring in time in the middle phase or the first two phases of being and well-being. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have the contraction, the reversion, which appears outside space and time at deification. And as I have previously commented on in my PhD thesis and my book, this is very similar to evolutionary biology. In fact, it bears a striking resemblance to circular depictions of the tree of life. And those if you know about evolution will be aware that the old-fashioned tree, pointy tree image of the tree of life is is no longer preferred by evolutionary biologists because it tends to privilege certain groups that are at the apex of the tree. And so Maximus is even politically correct in thinking of this divergence in a circular way rather than in a vertical way. A final thing I just want to mention briefly is that although the temporal expansion occurs from the most generic to the most particular, as ancestors radiate out from their, as species radiate out from their ancestors, Maximus's vision is also about the mutual interactions, interdependencies of the logoi. And he says very famously, all created things are positively defined by their own logoi and by the logoi that exist around them and which constitute their defining limits. So they don't just emanate and divide, they mutually co-constitute. And this is quite in line with more nuanced views of evolution today, where the causality of evolution is omnidirectional rather than just genes to phenotypes. And so this, you might want to therefore complicate the Neoplatonic diagram of the starburst by putting the causal arrows in many different directions. So what's the significance of all this? The Logos indwells all creation, defining and upholding it from the inside. Theologically, this is similar to the concept of the divine ideas that appeared later in Thomas Aquinas, but it can also be the divine wills or energies or even the person. Metaphysically, it's similar to the Aristotelian concept of an intrinsic formal cause. And scientifically, you could regard it as being the information content that bridges both God and creation. Although it's anachronistic to use the word panentheism to describe Maximus, later scholars have used that word, and perhaps a better word would be theopanist. God is in everything rather than everything is in God. And it's a species of panentheism which is not to be confused with the more kind of egregious, radical ones of process theology, where God himself is changing in response to creation. It's much more incarnational or emanational rather than relational. And it's also dynamic because the logoi are moving towards ultimate deification. And if you consider the famous maxim of ex nihilo, Maximus would cause you to want to qualify ex nihilo by saying creation is also ex deo. It also comes from God, since the ideas going into creation have nowhere else to come from except God himself. Also, creation is in some sense evolutionary in that the logoi are moving hierarchically and interactively, and evolution must be fundamentally good. Now, those are not points I want to dwell on in this presentation, but I do talk about them much more in my book. What I really want to reinforce are the bullets in yellow. All creatures, no matter how ephemeral, transitional, disordered, or accidental, must be fully intended and indwelt by God, if you take seriously Maximus's view. And that means that you could say the Logos is not just the Alpha and the Omega, but all the letters in between, that is to say, hoi polloi. Now, this is a very complicated slide. I won't have time to do it justice, but what I want to try to illustrate here is that in the circle, you have the Godhead. The triangle is the unparticipable essence of God. Circling God, you have the participle, uncreated energies or activities, which creation can participate in. And the Logos is emanating out into creation as the kind of Aristotelian form or information, and it's forming the logoi of being, the logoi tes ousias, in two ways. In a participatory way, so if you take that butterfly there, the beauty of that butterfly is participating in the beauty with a capital B of God. But the distinctive thing about Maximus is that there's also a univocal rather than analogical relationship. That particular butterfly, Vanessa Atalanta, the Red Admiral, is defined exactly by the logoi. And there's an intrinsic formal cause of the logoi forming that butterfly. Now, what stops that from being pantheism? Because if you're not careful, that's what it suggests, or divine idealism, where everything is merely a drama staged within the divine mind. Well, what makes it ex nihilo as well is the mode of existence, the tropos hypoxios, or the hypostasis. And this is apophatic. In other words, you can't really understand it. You can only understand it by saying what it isn't. And this is equivalent to the efficient cause, the power and the will of God to create a finite instantiation of this idea, the butterfly existing outside of God's mind. So that's my model, my interpretation of the Logos ontology. And that's a static snapshot, because remember, this is a dynamic panentheism in which things are moving towards deification in God. And John Zizioulas, the famous Greek Orthodox theologian, has talked about this in terms of the otherness and communion between God and creation. So the bridging, if you like, between God and creation can either be via the divine ideas or wills, but the otherness is safeguarded by the divine essence or materiality, or it could be the divine energies that provide the bridging. And again, it's the divine essence on the side of God that provides the otherness, or it could be the created essence in the case of creation. And the third interpretation is that the divine person is the communion, whereas the natures are what provides the chasm between the two. So that's very complicated. I apologize it's so complicated to try and get across in a short presentation. Let me move on now to the real practical application. And this lies in the recent emphases in evolutionary biology on the extended evolutionary synthesis that some of you may have heard about. And this has been very much welcomed by theology for various reasons. These are attempts to kind of nuance the neo-Darwinian dogma that evolution is blind, haphazard, and contingent. I'm referring here to things like evolutionary convergence, like the many different ways of having aerofoil shape, the many different camera eyes that have independently evolved. It's also referring to phenomena like self-assembly and constraint in evolution. So the protein folding, a very complicated phenomenon, seems to be highly constrained. Not all the possible permutations actually are possible, which is quite eerie. And then mutualistic symbiosis. So major transitions in evolution seem to have occurred through physical coalescence of things like bacterian cells or blue-green algae in cells to form mitochondria or chloroplasts. And then finally, the phenomenon of behaviorally led evolutionary change, like niche construction and the Baldwin effect. So this means that organisms with complex nervous systems can deliberately change their habitat, which leads to changed selection pressures and then changed future speciation events, rather than species being simply passive responders to a changing environment. Now, some theologians have welcomed this to the extent of even wanting to salvage the design argument from evolution. There's a picture here of a book by Roope Kojonen, a Finnish theologian, who's written on the compatibility of evolution and design. Quite an audacious thing to do, given how the design argument has very much fallen out of fashion over the last 50 years. And some of them have even, including Roope Kojonen, have enlisted Maximus as an ally to their argument. In fact, Christopher Southgate, in his famous book, The Groaning of Creation, published in 2008, said that the logoi, and he's referring to Maximus here, resemble points and peaks within evolutionary fitness landscapes. Every peak as a possibility imagined in the mind of God, hence possessing divinely given patterns of being. So this is the famous image of the adaptive landscape where the X and Y coordinates refer to different phenotypes, and the z-axis refers to fitness, and populations will migrate under selection pressure to the peaks. And Kojonen requoted this in his book. However, my argument is this implies that the divergent, contingent, and transitional in evolution are somehow less logoi endowed and less theophanic, displaying God. For example, the adaptive radiation of the beetles, the largest family of animals on Earth, all those evolutionary dead ends and transitional intermediates, and all of those non-reproducing individual progeny variants. So if you take a bird's eye view of that adaptive landscape, what these authors seem to be suggesting is that the logos or the logoi are only occupying the summits of the peaks. And all of the trajectories of evolution towards those peaks are merely instrumental to God. All of those points of extinction, all those cul-de-sacs are not really the logoi. It's only the peaks. However, I would argue, based on Maximus's view of the cosmos, that all things, at least all good things, are logos endowed. Even the contingent, the particular, the ephemeral, the transitional, and the one-off. That is to say, the despised and neglected, the hoi polloi. God is not orchestrating evolution from afar. He is living it out as a person, the logos in all things. So the lack of order, constraint, or law-like behavior does not mean a lack of goodness, but points to divine freedom. And accidental mutations that initiate speciation events are fully controlled by God. And this also avoids a God of the gaps mentality, whereby we attribute only some things to God's good design. An example here is that a random array of dots you might think is disordered, less designoid, to quote a Richard Dawkins word, less specified, whereas an ordered array seems more redolent of divine design. Whereas if the logoi is in all things, then ironically, the random array, which takes more information to specify, is actually more indicative of design. And this goes back to David Bohm, the famous physicist, who said that a complicated line like the diagram on the left, you would not want to call disordered, because it actually has an even greater high degree of order. It needs more specification. So in conclusion, Maximus the Confessor's logoi cosmology amounts to a species of panentheism or theopanism, and it surpasses, I believe, Platonic or participatory models of divine creature relationship in dignifying the particulars of creation, the hoi polloi, as well as the universals or ideal types. Therefore, Maximus should not, in my view, be enlisted in support of selective attributions of divine design that privilege the ordered, stable, and final over the chaotic, transitional, or ephemeral. Starting from Maximus's viewpoint of the logos in all things, we should therefore recalibrate our expectations of what it is to be designed. Thank you very much.
My goodness me, thank you very much, Andrew, for that. I can see that some people are already putting some questions in, so I know that there will probably be some more because I don't know about everyone else, but I have a number buzzing around my head on so many different levels. Thank you for that and for the challenges I think that both gives us, but the opportunities it opens. So I'm going to start with the first question that's been put into the chat. If anyone else has questions, please, if you put your hand up or unmute so that I can see that you have a question, or indeed put it in the chat. But the first question for you, Andrew, is from Ellen Grace. If mutations are directed by God, does this mean that harmful mutations are also directed by God?
Yes, thank you for that. I was expecting someone to ask about the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, which is obviously a huge question, which I have very conveniently bracketed out of my presentation, but I do talk about a lot in my book. Well, I think the first thing to think about is what is the harmfulness of a mutation. A mutation is something that creates variability, and I don't think there's anything harmful about variability per se. It's whether or not the particular variant ends up having a life which is not a good life for it in some sense. Like if it's got a complex nervous system, does it suffer pain? And that comes about because of things like competition, a mismatch between its phenotype and its environment, or its internal environment even. And it is a very difficult question. I bring to bear some other resources from Maximus and the Eastern tradition in my book to try to answer this, but I'm not claiming I fully answered it. One of which is the concept of the garments of skin from Gregory of Nyssa. These are accretions put in place by God to make life more painful deliberately as a punishment and remedial action by God to drive creatures more towards God. And unlike many theodicies where you have a mismatch with evolution because of the chronology, Maximus envisages a simultaneous and coextensive creation and fall from the very beginning. So all of these garments of skin, which might include competition, predation, parasitism, all those kind of things, exist from the very beginning in anticipation of humankind's sin. So that's my best attempt at answering it within the Eastern tradition. Those who want to address this, other kind of theologians of evolution, are motivated to say that God is not interested in the detail. He's only interested in the high points, because that gets God off the hook from the mutations, from the randomness and the chaos. And so he may be steering, like Arthur Peacock would say, evolution in the right direction or coaxing it, but he's not responsible for the detail. So that's another strategy, but I don't think it fits with Maximus.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any other questions from anyone? You can see some cameras on. I haven't got any other questions at the moment in the chat. Or whether Ellen wanted to come back. Oh, Luca.
Yeah, hi, Andrew. As always, very good. Your presentation are always very good. Today I discovered something which I didn't pay attention before, which is this simultaneity of creation. This all creatures kind of stay on the same plane. So there is not like a gradual ascension towards human being, right? From what I understood. So does this not create a problem in terms of the uniqueness of human being, like the imago Dei that human beings have, given that there is this kind of politically correct judgment of the evolution towards all species?
Yes, thank you for that excellent question, Luca. I think the answer to that, my answer to that, would be to go back to that complicated diagram whereby the butterfly is defined by God in two ways. It's defined analogically by participation, and it's defined univocally in its particularity. So the first one, the analogical participation, would account for why some things seem to image God better than others. So things participate in God's transcendent attributes, goodness, beauty, truth, etc., in different ways, and whilst at the same time as particular entities being fully defined by God. Now, there is a paradox if you believe Maximus is saying the logoi are also the logos, because they are, in a mystical sense, fully the logos, but they also have different levels of participation. So a rock, for example, is not participating or reflecting God. The vestiges of the Trinity in it are not as strong as the vestiges of the Trinity in a chimpanzee, for example, and certainly not as a human being. Does that make sense? I think you've frozen.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question, if there is anyone with a question. Yes, Paul is waving at me.
So, I'm just thinking about the sort of particulate and boundaries of logoi. For instance, do mitochondria, are they are they separate logoi from the logoi that produce the nuclear DNA? I suppose I'm asking about individuality, the individuality of logoi and the individuality that we find in creation. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you for that question. That's a very instructive question, because I think the logoi, although Maximus doesn't go into it, this is my construction of Maximus, that because the logoi are all pervasive, they define everything. But whether you can say that there's a boundary between this logoi and this logoi is a difficult thing, because everything is smeared out and hugely complex and interrelated, as per that quote, that the logoi are defined by the logoi around them even. So I think there are some attributes that you might want to say reflect divine excellencies and nobilities. So to that extent, there is a Platonic aspect to it, that there are categories, there is an element of typology, but there's also a strong element of nominalism going on here, that the logoi define at an atomistic level, but also at all levels higher than the atoms, and all interacting complex ecosystems. So I certainly, some authors have said that the logoi are like spiritual DNA, and I'd want to distance myself a bit from that, because that suggests a very naive kind of unfolding of everything, a very gene-centered view of evolution, where, like Russian nested dolls, everything emanates just from the DNA, when actually a more nuanced view of evolution today would say that it's the environment and the ecosystems define organisms as much as their DNA does.
Yes. Yeah, and also DNA is much more dynamic than we thought.
Yes.
So it's always tempting to look at DNA as a definition,
Yes.
a sort of blueprint, a digital blueprint for something, but actually it's much more dynamic.
Exactly.
And changes much more regularly. And that is epigenetics, isn't it?
Yes. It's more like a cake recipe than a blueprint.
Which changes constantly, and
Yes.
the WI would argue about it. Is it a Victoria sponge?
Indeed.
Well, we are indeed. I didn't expect to be talking about Victoria sponges this afternoon, but it's fantastic. Thank you. We're heading into new papers in about 5 minutes, but I think I would like to just round up from my point of view, coming perhaps from a bit of left field in some ways. But for me, there was a real resonance in thinking sort of pastorally and in terms of personal growth, a personal identity, particularly with our young people today, that there's an awful lot from what you are looking at that offers a sense of understanding of the self in a different way. And I didn't know how you might feel about that as a direction of travel from what you looked at.
Yes, that's a good, interesting. I'll have to think more about that. But I suppose what you're saying is that there's like a corollary or an analogy to evolution in today's society, that there are the left behinds, the people who seem just to be instruments or unimportant, and actually God is in all of them and values each of them. So there's a great danger in just valuing the typologies, the perfect forms, as it were.
Very much so, and that had a real resonance for me. So thank you. Something very new to think about. So on behalf of all of us, I think thank you so much, Andrew. A huge amount to take away, to think about, and to challenge us with today. And really appreciate it. I think you are chairing the New Voices shortly, so we'll give you a moment to catch your breath. And thank you to everyone else for the great questions in this session.